Hello everybody, it's Claire here from Sewing by Claire, and I'm joined today by Harvey the Hedgehog, and I think it's about time that we made him some clothes, wouldn't you agree? So we're going to start today on making his shirt, then we're going to move on in time to making his trousers, then his waistcoat, then his jacket. And my thought process behind that is that that's the way that we would get him dressed anyway. So we put the shirt on first, then the trousers, then the waistcoat. So that's my method in my madness for how we're going to follow along. So I've already got my pattern here, and I picked this one up from Lilly Rose Dolls, and I'll pop their website up here for you so that you'll be able to pick up your pattern too. And I'm working with my own fabrics from my stash. I'm not working with a kit, so I'm just picked out whatever I could and what I found would work, and I've actually got this combination here. So we've got the white for the shirt, which we will be using today. Hopefully it's not going to white out too much under the lights, but unfortunately the white is the best colour for him. Then got this lovely Rifle Paper Company fabric for the waistcoat, although I'm concerned the flowers might be a little bit big, but I think the colours work really nicely. And then I've got this bottle green needle cord, which I'm going to use for his jacket and his trousers and his hat. So hopefully I'll have enough of all of that to get started. If you've not worked with Lilly Rose Dolls patterns before, then there's a couple of tips for you just to make sure that we're starting off on the right foot, and so I'm going to share those with you. And then as we're going through, for those that aren't familiar with dressmaking, then I'm going to share you some tips and tricks for making clothes, I mean in this case for dolls, but obviously all of the skills that you'll learn in these videos making these dolls clothes are directly transferable to either children's, adult clothes, and obviously dolls clothes as well for the other characters. So there's lots of tips that you can pick up and lots of ways of working with the fabric, which you'll just hear me repeat time and time again on other videos in the future. But I never know whether you're jumping in and this one is your first video or your 20th, so I have to just treat everybody as if we're starting from scratch again. Hopefully it's not too boring for you. Just fast forward through anything that you already know, or if you want to sit and have a listen, then do. You never know, you might pick something up. And I have had in the comments before from intermediate sews where they have said that they've actually picked up some tips, so that's always good to know, and hopefully that gives you a bit of confidence as well that we're going to get a good result. I also normally put in a bit of a finished video, just sort of jump back a Back to the Future kind of video if you like, clip, and just show you the finished shirt on the character, so you can see straight away whether or not you want to continue making this and whether you're happy with the finish that I get on my garment and whether you're happy with my teaching. That's the theory. So I'll pop that clip in a moment before we then get on to tilting the camera down and getting started. So in true Back to the Future style, I'm just jumping ahead to show you Harvey's finished shirt. It does match at the bottom, I promise. His lovely buttons on there, his collar is sitting beautifully, his sleeves have been set in really nicely, and we've got that lovely curved hem on the bottom of the shirt and on the front of the shirt here as well. So I hope that you think that I've made a lovely job of his shirt, and that you'd like to continue sewing along with me. And if that's the case, I'll shush and you can get started. Before you do get started, a really big thank you to Claire and Richard of Lilly Rose Dolls for gifting the pattern to me so that I can bring this sewing tutorial to you. I really do appreciate that from them, their help and support, and I hope you're going to enjoy all of the videos in 2024. Okay, so just to show you here, I've got the pattern, and you'll need to turn to the back pages of your pattern in order to cut out your shirt pieces. And we've got all of those here, which I've already done. Now, the important thing to remember is that when you're tracing these out, and I would strongly recommend that you get into the habit of tracing off your pattern pieces so that you can save your actual pattern itself as an intact copy. And you can pick up tracing paper, or you can use greaseproof paper from a lot of different stores. You know, it doesn't have to be expensive, it just needs to do the trick, just to be able to pin onto your fabric in order that you can cut it out. But the other thing you'll notice here is that I've got an extra line and an extra amount of pattern around my pieces, and that's because I've added 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimetre seam allowance around the majority of the edges of these pattern pieces. Now, there is a video on my channel about how to work with the pattern for Lilly Rose Dolls, and it doesn't matter whether you're working with let's get a shirt piece, let me just show you on here. Doesn't matter whether you're working, oh sorry for the crinkling, whether you're working with the doll pattern or you're working with the clothing pattern, you will need to add seam allowance. the drawn line on your pattern here is your stitching line. So just to be really clear, it does say at the bottom of the page, add 1/4 inch seam allowance unless otherwise indicated, and that's what you will need to do. So if we look at this collar piece just here that I've got, then you'll see that my traced pattern piece, if I can get it right for you, sits perfectly over the top, and I just put my tracing paper over the top. I trace through it with a pen in this case, but then once I've done that, I remove it from the pattern and I then add on my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm not going to go over that again now because it's in a previous video that you can look at. So if you have a look at my video called Lilly Rose Dolls Working with the Pattern in the Beginner Basics series, then you'll be able to find that pattern. And I've done that for most of these pieces. There are some exceptions. On the back of the shirt, if there's where there is the fold line, we do not add seam allowance to that. So you can see I've got seam allowance around the back, neck, the shoulder, the arm side, the side seam and the hem, but nothing extra added onto that back line because that's got to go right up to the fold and we don't need any seam allowance there. Likewise, on the back of the back lining, it actually says on the pattern, do not add seam allowance to this curved edge. So I've only added it onto this side edge here, which will be on the shoulder and the back of the neck there. So that's all fine. And then the other place where you don't need to add any seam allowance is on this front facing here, because that's going to, we're going to neaten that, but then that will fold back in order that this edge here can enclose the collar for us, and then that'll sit nicely and just give that button placket down the front. So those are the things that you need to know. Everywhere else, on the sleeves all the way round, on the collar all the way round, and that's where we are now with the pattern. You'll also notice I've got my freezer bag, and this is how I keep my pattern pieces to make sure they all stay together. So my master copy of my pattern stays intact and will stay with the actual original pattern all intact. And then as I'm working, all of these pattern pieces here will go into a little freezer bag with the name of the garment on it and that it's a Lilly Rose Dolls design. And that way then I can just sift through those bags and I can pick out the garment that I want should I want to make this again, and I'm sure I may well do. The other thing to say is that whilst I'm making this shirt for Harvey, if you see a design on another character that looks similar to a pattern you've already got, just check in your stash to see if you've already traced that pattern off, because it may be that one of the other characters is wearing the same waistcoat or wearing the same jacket or the same trousers or the same hat or shirt, and therefore you don't need to go through that tracing process again because you've already got it. So just have a look through and make sure that you're happy with that. The other thing to say is that I'm working on the 16-inch size pattern, but all of the instructions remain the same for any of the sizes that you're working with. So it's a generic video, if you like, how-to tutorial, which will show you how to put this shirt together regardless of the size that you're working on. So if you're, working on the 10-inch, or you're working on, any of the larger sizes, I'm hesitating because I can't remember which sizes Harvey comes in, but then just know that I'm working on the 16-inch, and therefore if you're working on something smaller, it might just be a little bit fiddlier. But don't forget that you can always resort to hand stitching, where you may have a little bit more control into those fiddly corners than using your machine, but I'm going to use my machine today in order to help you with that. Okay, that's all of that over and done with, all the housekeeping over and done with, so let me just have a chat about my fabric. So the fabric that I've used today is this, I've chosen to use today, is this 100% cotton fabric, which is why it's a little bit creased, and that is very typical of 100% cotton fabric. It does crease and hold on to those creases well. You can spray starch it, but I didn't want to put starch onto this before we actually got round to sewing it, because I want that flexibility to be able to work with the fabric, but in the future we can give it a really stiff steam if we want to, and that will be better. This one is actually a bed sheet that I'm using. It's a great way of getting a decent amount of fabric cheaply and great for using in this case for the shirt, because the majority of it you're not going to see. We're only really going to see the collar, and so in that respect this fabric will work well. But I would stay away from a cotton poplin, because I think a cotton poplin is a little too stiff, but this fabric here has got a kind of softness to it, and you can see how that's kind of crinkling in my hand, so that'll be a nice one to use. You could also use a cotton lawn, and also don't forget to check through your charity shop bag, because if you've got any old work shirts or old school shirts for children, or for work shirts for guys, or for ladies in that matter, then you can cut those down and use that fabric really well for doing these types of doll garments. So you don't need to go out and buy brand new fabric, especially if you're on a budget. Then, you know, look around and see what you've got. And as I say, I'm going to be using this old sheet here. Okay, let me get my pattern together. We've got our fabric together and we'll get started. Okay, so when we're working with a dressmaking pattern for making a garment, and we're working with a woven fabric, and by a woven fabric I mean something that doesn't have any stretch to it. There's no stretch on any of this, either north to south or east to west. There's no stretch with that at all. And so we have to lay our pattern pieces down carefully, because the designer of any dressmaking garment will have chosen which way this fabric should be cut, whether it should be cut on what they call straight of grain, which is in line with the way that this fabric has been woven. Now, if you look on your edge, if you've got a cut edge, you'll see that if you pull it in some directions, you'll get these threads that just come off, and that will show you the direction that this has been woven. And there's a warp and a weft thread, and I always get them mixed up, and to some extent for this type of garment it doesn't matter so much. But generally speaking, if you have what's called a selvage edge, where you have a bound edge to your fabric that doesn't fray, then if you've got a grain line, which is this kind of mark just here, see this arrow with a double edge to it, double end to it, then that is a grain line, and that wants to go in line either north to south or east to west with the way that this fabric has been woven. And that's quite important, because if ever you've bought a garment and it won't sit straight when you're trying to iron it, it means that it's been cut off grain, and then as the fabric gets washed, then it doesn't work very, it won't keep its shape and look nice for you. So we try to get into those good habits, even though we're sewing on a smaller scale, we try and bring these good habits into what we're doing now with our sewing. So the first thing that I want to do is have a look at this fabric and see where that warp and weft are going. And it just means that the north to south and the east to west. And I fold my fabric on the edge here, and I try to make sure that I'm sort of following the line down the edge of the fabric here, so that nothing's going off at an angle. So if I had a striped fabric, and it was woven with a thread going through the fabric, then I'd want that to be really straight and on this fold, and that's what we're looking for when I talk about getting the fabric onto straight of grain. You can do a little rip and then you can tear it, but sometimes on fabrics you can actually, if you look carefully, and get your magnifying glass out if you need it, or your reading glasses, and actually have a look closely, and you'll see that that grain line running through the garment. So I think I'm going to be okay on where we are at the moment, and so I'm now going to have a look at my pattern pieces. I normally place my items on the fold first, and we've got this fold instruction just here with this little angled fold arrow, and so that's going to go on the fold line of my fabric just here. Let's get some pins, and I'll just roughly pin this on now, and I try and pin it in the seam allowance if I can, because I know that way then I'm not going to, if I'm working with a delicate fabric, I'm not going to mark it with my pinholes. So let's just pop that on there now, and you want the fold of the folded edge here where it says fold to be right on that folded edge of your fabric. So here's my extra sort of bit that I've turned over. Ignore that this is all over the place, because it's been used from face masks and what have you. So the other thing that we're looking at as well, whether is something says cut 2 or cut 1, and we want to be able to make sure that we get those. So like the back lining is only cut 1, but the collar is cut 2, the shirt is cut 1. So we've got a couple of cut 2s down here, which is the sleeves. So let's just have a look and see. The sleeve will fit in nicely here. Right, let's put the sleeve in just there, because that fits nicely just there. And what I'm going to need is a tape measure. Because when we've got a grain line here on a pattern piece and we're away from the folded edge, so we're not going to put it up against a fold, we need to make sure that this pattern piece is straight and not twisted at all. And the way that we do that is we will take, and I'm just trying to find a ruler to use. I'll use my seam gauge here. So what I'm just going to do, while I've got a bigger pattern piece and only a small line, I'm just going to extend that drawn line for the fold line, and not fold line, for the grain line. And I've just extended it, if you can see, from where it was originally up towards the top and up down towards the bottom. And while we're here, we'll do that on the front piece as well, so that that can be nice and straight. So just extend it pretty much as far as you can do. The longer it is, the better. So that's that, that's the fold line on those. On those ones it doesn't matter so much, and that's fine, okay. Because then what we do is when we place our pattern piece onto our fabric, we are then going to use our tape measure, and we are going to measure from that edge. Let's do it on centimetres, because most people I think will use centimetres. So I think that if I have the mark of 12 centimetres on the folded edge, I can get the top of my grain line just there to be at 12.2. So let me just put a pin towards the top of that piece now, just to anchor that top bit down at the 12 point. And then if I go down here and put my tape measure again at the bottom, oh look, can you see how this is twisted off the grain line? It's not anywhere near straight. So now I'm going to pull out the bottom of this pattern piece until it's sitting straight, and I'm happy that I'm on straight that measurement at the top of the grain line to the folded edge, and the bottom of the grain line to the folded edge is exactly the same at these 2 points, both 12 centimetres for me for that mark. Once I've got that in place, then I'll just pin my pattern piece onto the fabric and move on to the next one. So we've now got this collar facing here. Let's see if we can fit that in. And I'm going to do the same, although it's much shorter. It's more difficult to tell if it's straight or not on a shorter piece. Let's just pull that. And I do try and save fabric if I can do. Let's have that about there. So that's about 12.2, about 12.2. So we're trying to make sure that that's as straight as we can. Let's pop a couple of pins in to hold that in place. That's there. Okay, make sure it's not overlapping any, and I can just get that in on the edge there, so that's fine. And then we're going to go to our shirt piece as well. And I would say that if you've got a fabric where you've got a folded edge, try not to put a pattern piece right up here against the folded edge when you're not using it, because you'll get more use out of that piece of fabric as a whole than you will do if you cut into it. So for me, I'm now going to put this piece on here, and let's have a look and see where that is. A little bit extra there, so that can be just, let's do 14.5. And so you can see, you can just sort out your pattern piece so that you're happy with the measurement. And then let's just go down to the bottom down here, and we'll measure again just down the bottom here, and we'll see that that's at the same measurement that we've already got, and then I can pin that on. And I've just put some more pins around all the other pieces as well, just to make sure they're on properly. And then the final bit we've got is the back facing, and we only need to cut one of these. And so I've just folded it in half because I've got a nice little gap just here on my fold, and that will just fit that in just nicely. And because we've folded it in half, that will now be just one that we'll be cutting. So I've lined up the folded edge of the piece of paper, and it's a symmetrical pattern piece. That's why I've been able to fold it in half. And I'm just going to pin that now. Oops, if I get my pins out, my pin cushion, onto my piece of fabric, and then we'll be ready to cut these out. So let's just do a quick check. We've got the back piece cut on the fold here. We've got our sleeve, we'll have 2 of those. We've got our collar, we need 2, and we've got our shirt front that we'll need 2, and then we've got our back lining, or back facing, it should really be, is a back facing, then that's cut 1 as well, so that's all ready. So let's just get our scissors then and cut this out, and we're going to cut out as close to the drawn line as we can do, for including our seam allowance, because that's going to make sure that everything fits together in our fabric jigsaw puzzle quite nicely. And then I'll meet you back here once we've cut it out. And just a little tip that I've just thought of, like here on the arm side when we're cutting it out, if you cut along the straighter lines first and you've got this quite tight area in here, rather than trying to cut it out whilst it's flat on your work surface, then you can just lift it up. And I wouldn't advocate, if you were doing dressmaking for children or adults, that you lift it up and cut it out like this. But just for these dolls' clothes, then I'm a little more lenient on some little points. But that way it's much easier to cut out that sharp edge than trying to get around. So again, just be aware of that. I just sort of cut straight across that arm side while it was on my in a whole piece of my fabric, and then just trimmed it round afterwards once I separated it, and that works really well. Okay, and so we've got all of our cut out pattern pieces here. We've got the shirt back, the two sleeves, the back lining, the shirt collar, and then the front of the shirt. And what we need to do now is just mark our notches. And to do this, I'm going to use some snips, which are these like sewing things, which are really useful. But anything that's small and got a sharp point to them, you want to use. And the reason I say that is because you may have some scissors that you want to use, and you may think that you're going to mark your notches by cutting this way, and we don't want to be putting all of our fabric through the blades of our scissors, because in that way we can inadvertently, if we press a little bit too hard or the fabric's a bit thicker than we think, we can cut off part of our fabric piece. So I always use a smaller pair of scissors, and I make sure that if I'm using a smaller pair of scissors, or if I'm using a big scissor, I only use the nose of them, and then we're just going to put a little notch into our fabric, and I just do a couple of millimeters into the seam allowance, just so that it shows me then that there's a little match point there, and there's one just here as well. Just make sure I don't try and go through a pin. So those two will go on top of each other, and that's on the shirt front, so it's marking points A on the pattern. There's two on there, and then also on the sleeve we've got a mark here for the gathering, a mark for the centre, and then another mark for the gathering down here, and I'll show you how to use those notches. But it just puts a little mark point in your fabric so that you know where you are for later on. The other thing that I would suggest you do is put one at the centre back of your neck facing, because that helps match everything up, and one at the centre back of your neck. Just a little snip just on that fold line there, and it'll just help you. Just a couple of millimeters, that's all you need. And the collar as well. Let's do the collar as well. So let's fold that in half. So we've got that nicely together. I'm going to move that pin because that pin's right in the way of where I want to snip. So I'm folding my collar in half, and I'm just putting a little snip through both sides, and it's just on that tighter curve, just on that inside curve. So you only need it on this top edge, you don't need it on the bottom. So yeah, got a little snip there, that'll help us line everything up too. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is take out some of these pins, but I'll still leave one pin in order to tell me what I'm working with. And what we'll actually do now is we'll just establish which is our right side and our wrong side. So I'm going to have the right side as being, and let me just have a look on this piece. Right, the right side is going to be the outside edge. So when I'm marking my outside edges with, I just put a pin through twice like that, and then that will tell me, especially on these types of fabrics where it's a plain colour and you can't really tell the right from the back, it's much easier to mark them as you're cutting them out. So the top side was that, so let's just put that to mark the right side, and then I just pin my pattern piece back onto it again. That way we do. And I think dressmaking, a lot of it is about not getting confused and not getting lost. So a lot of these tips are things that I've picked up over the years just to help me find my way around everything and make sure that I can put my hand on what I want straight away. So again with this one, I'm going to take the pattern piece off, but I had wrong sides together. So when I open this up, I'm going to make sure that the wrong sides are pulled out away from each other. So my wrong side is up, and then in the middle of each piece, if this was a delicate fabric I wouldn't mark it in the middle, but cotton's very forgiving, so I'm just going to put a double pin through, so that'll tell me that that's the right way up, and then I just can pop my one pin through that pattern piece, holding that together. So let's do that again with this front shirt piece. Let's take all of our pins out to start off with, because that makes it easier when we're working with it later on. All of the pins out, just take the pattern piece off for the moment, and I've got my right side, my wrong sides are together, so I want to put the wrong side to the down onto my work surface. So I'm pulling them apart and then I'm putting them down onto the work surface. And as you can see, that will make sure then, like on this piece here, we've got a left and a right because we need the mirrored copies. And if I had, let me just mark this piece first, just so I don't get myself confused. Let's put those pins in just to mark the front. So I know that's the right way round, because if I'd have got them on my work surface, my cutting mat, and they were looking like that, so look for the arm side, look for the neck, and look for this edge here, and they were both pointing the same direction with this long curve here and going away from each other, that would have given me 2 lefts or 2 rights, and that's not what we need. We need to have it so that you can put those long curves together and they're going to match at the shoulder point as it will be, and that's the correct way. So just make sure you get like this crescent shape in the middle here, and then you'll know that you've got a left and a right. Okay, so they can go on top of each other just roughly, just so that we know that they're together, and a pattern pin through there as well. The collar is fairly straightforward. Take all of the pins out. I'm just going to lay them down so that the wrong sides are down onto my cutting mat. So let's just lift that off for a second. Open these out. The top one's fine, and the bottom one just needs turning over. So that's right sides out for that, and put our pins in just to remind us that that's the right side. And once I've done that, then I can put my pattern piece back on again. Oops. And then finally with the back, pins out. There's no notches on here at all, so that's good, apart from the one we did at the back of the neck. Just lift off the pattern piece. I'm just going to open that out and then just flick it so that the wrong side is down onto my cutting mat, and then I can then just mark that with a pin. And then I can just put that back pattern piece back on there, and that will tell me that that's the back. So that's the way that I would do it to stay organised, and then we're going to get ready to start and do some sewing. But hopefully those little tips and tricks, if you can incorporate that in all of your sewing, over time it'll just become second nature to you. Then you'll find that really helpful whenever you're doing all sorts of projects, whatever they are, and you'll be surprised how helpful it can be and just save you a bit of head scratching. Okay, let's get on to the next bit. Okay, so the first 2 things we're going to be working with is the back lining. You might also know it as a back facing, but it says back lining in the pattern. So we need that piece out, and then we need the 2 shirt fronts out as well. So I've got that pattern piece out. And what we're going to do is, if we work with let's work with the back facing first. That's a nice little piece, isn't it? Just rather than complicated shapes. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to neaten this raw edge here, and we do that because we don't want that to fray when the Harvey the character is wearing it. And all it means is that we're going to if you've got an overlocker, you can overlock along that edge. If you've got a zigzag on your machine, then you can zigzag it. Or if you've not got either of those 2, then you can also use pinking shears, which are the scissors with the triangular blades to them. And you can just take a smidge, just a little bit, off that edge there, and it'll just cut those triangles in for you. I'm going to use a zigzag on mine because I think that most people will have a zigzag. But if you're hand sewing, then you could always do a nice neat little overstitch over this edge here. It'll just stop it from fraying. Once we've done that one, we're then going to go on to our front pattern pieces, and remember that long curved edge that I spoke about here? I'll put on here, you'll be able to see it better. So these 2 edges here, where we didn't add the seam allowance in our pattern, we are going to neaten both of those, and you're going to be able to start from the top to the bottom on one, but then from the bottom to the top on another, because you'll need to in order to sort that through. Okay, so let me get my machine and we'll get that set up, and I'll talk to you about the settings that I use for my zigzag stitch. Okay, so I've got my machine on. I've just loaded it up with a white thread. I'm just using a polyester thread. I know I'm using a cotton fabric, but it's just for a doll, so it's not my very best Sunday best clothing for myself. So I do make those economies where I can, and I think a lot of people might well choose to do the same. So I've just got a polyester, and this is a moon thread in there, which is great for using, and I've got the same in my bobbin and in the top thread. Then what you want to do is have a look on your machine, and you want to choose a zigzag stitch. So this one on mine is stitch number 8. So I've just changed my stitch to number 8 for my zigzag. and then I just go through the settings. So my stitch width on here is a 5, which is quite a wide. That's the distance, I'm going to say, between the zig and the zag. So you're going to have your needle going on one point of the triangle, and then it's going to come out on the other point of the triangle. So one's the zig and one's the zag, is the way I describe it. And we want the zig to go into the fabric on the very edge just along here, but we want the zag to be at or just over the edge of the fabric. And so for that, I don't think I need a 5 stitch, otherwise that's going to take up quite a lot of my fabric here. And what you can do is you can do a test. Let's just get a piece of fabric and I'll just show you. Well, you might not be able to see it very well because of the colour. So this is a 5. Let me just get an edge just to be able to show you. And it also bunches up, and I also use my needle down button, which always leaves my needle away. So I think a 3 is going to be more than enough for this. So if I start again on a 3, hopefully when I take this out, you'll be able to see the difference between the two. So on here, you can see the 5 is going over the edge and has really tightened that up. But the 3 is going towards the edge, but not bunching it up quite so much. So I'm going to use a 3 on mine. That's going to be fine. And then the other setting is the stitch width. That's the how long between each of these down turns. And that's probably enough for dolls' clothing. These little bits on the edge here are called whiskers, and we'll trim those off at the end. And I'll show you what we do with that. But I'm going to use my stitch number 8, which is my zigzag. So find your zigzag. And I've got a zig and a zag distance from here to here of 3, and then I'm using my 2, which is the distance along here, because it's just to tidy it up. These clothes, my character clothes, aren't going to get played with as toys. They are heirloom dolls, so they're not really intended as being playthings, but also it just makes it easier just to be able to, it just makes it not fray, which is, we want a nice finish really, don't we? So let's just, I've got the right side up, as you can see from, you might not be able to see from my pin, but my pin's in there. I can see that poke is on the top there, and I'm just going to gradually just take my fabric along through here and put in some pressure with my left hand here, and that will just make sure that we stay on the fabric and just going along. This fabric is quite thin, so it's not going to be my best stitching, but it'll be functional, and that's what we need at this moment in time. So once we get to the end, take my piece of work out, and I always take my threads off straight away, starting and stopping threads off. And there we've got our edge there all nicely stitched. The other thing that I'll do with these whiskers is at this stage here is I will just snip those off, but just making sure that I don't go through any of the threads of my zigzag stitches, and that will just neaten that edge off. So there's our back facing, all nice and neat now. And then I'm now going to go ahead and sew down this long edge here and just do the same. So with the right side of my fabric facing upwards, as you can see from my pin. And this is why it does help us just keep organised. And then just going to sew across the edge here. Just try and be careful not to stretch your fabric out. Just let the machine pull it through at the speed it wants to. We're just guiding it to make sure that it's feeding through okay. And then what I can do on the end here is I can put the second one straight in. And I'll just pull it through. Again with the top side up. Okay, no reversing on that. I don't feel the need to reverse backwards and forwards on that. So just take our threads off, separate the two out, and there we've got those 3 pieces now, have now got those edges neatened, and they're all ready to go. So if you want to get to the same stage, and then we'll move on. Okay, so I've just picked up the back of the shirt, so I've got that now to be able to use. So let's put that pin out of the, oh, we're going to need some pins, aren't we, actually? And then I'm going to put my pattern piece for the back straight into my freezer bag so I don't lose those. That's there for them for future reference. And then using our pins, marking the top and the bottom so we know where we are, then what I'm going to do is take first one right side of the shirt top, because we've got a pin in, and I'm going to turn that over and then put it down onto my pattern piece. And we're attaching the shoulder at the edge here, This is the edge that I've just neatened, so we're not using that section, so you should have no zigzagging on this section at all at the moment. And then I just want to use a pin on either side, just here, of that shoulder seam. And you'll remember we've got a little notch in the top of our shoulder seam, so we know about that. And then we're going to sew this together using 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimetre seam allowance, because that's the amount that we added on. And the way that I work out that is I can move, let's take it off a zigzag stitch first. So back to a straight stitch. And what I use, I like to use my seam gauge, which is here. And then I've got this little slider on it. But if I put my finger against my needle at the back here and put my seam gauge against it, then I can move my needle across to the right. You may well have that ability on yours. It's really useful if you have, until the 1/4 inch is on the edge of the presser foot here, and then I can use the edge of my presser foot for my seam allowance, which makes that nice and easy. You've also got markings on your plate here, and you can use the edge of your fabric as well against those edges as well to give you that same marking. It just depends on how you want to work. Both are right. There's often several ways of doing things in sewing. So we're going to go forwards and backwards, and I'm going to put my needle in my work. I'm just using a standard 2.2 construction stitch for this. I don't sew over pins, so always take out your pins, and then I'm going to reverse at the end of that seam as well. Take the needle out of the work, press the foot up, take our threads off, and then we can see we've got our little seam just sewn just on the edge just there. And then when we open this out, look, our pins are together, so that shows us that we've got right sides together. And then this edge here should be neatened as well, so we can neaten that off. So let's take this back to a zigzag stitch, which is our number 8, and then we width of 3, and then we can just quickly just run along this edge and just neaten it. I'm putting my seam allowances together, but that's just for ease and just for speed really, because I'm on the video. You can do those separately if you wanted to. You can overlock them, and you can use your pinking shears if you wanted to. Okay, so if we open that front out, then you'll be able to see how that's all meeting nicely at that shoulder point, and just finger press that open. And then we're going to get our other front piece with the pin on the top. We're going to turn that over so that the two pins are touching together with the pin heads, and then we're going to match up that shoulder seam as well onto the other side. 2 pins in, one at the start of the seam and one at the stop, just while we take this to the machine. And the reason why I don't put one in the middle is because I find that the edges will twist. So if you just put a pin just in the middle there, then when you're carrying it to the machine, sometimes things can twist out of shape. So I do find that if you put your raw edges together and then you use 2 pins, you'll get a much more accurate result with your sewing. So again, take this off the zigzag, back to the needle position that we needed for our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to sew our seam here. Reverse. Needle in the work before you take your pin out, just so that it'll hold it still for you, and then we're going to carry on and reverse at the end. Needle out of the work. Oops, threads off, and then we're going to take this back to a zigzag stitch, and we can do that. Now if you wanted to have sewn both shoulder seams first and then zigzag them both together, then you could do that at the same as well. It's just I'm just saying it as I go along. So there we go. So now that we have got a seam sewn, if we just open this out, now we've got the back and the 2 fronts attached. We know which is the right side because all of that seam allowance is going to be on the inside. We can take these pins out now, showing us which is the right side, because we now know that. Got a few whiskers on this edge. Let me just take those off. Neaten it up a little bit, because that always helps. Okay, that'll do for now. So the next thing that we're going to do then is we're going to take our facing piece here, which is this semicircle bit here, not the collar is much longer, and we're going to, noting our pin again in the middle here, we're going to turn that over so that the pin goes down, and then the collar, this facing, is going to match first onto one side of the edge here. So we put our pins in there. And then this other section is going to come onto the other front section just here. And I'm matching up the raw edges of my zigzag line, so that'll look like it's almost continuous when we get to that point. And I am noting on mine that I've got a little bit extra on that seam allowance, so I'll probably just have to take some of that off at some stage. But for now, I've actually made sure that the zigzag seam line matches together. And when I put this down on my work surface before I've sewn it, just so we can check, we can make sure that this is all the right way round, because we've got the front of the shirt back and the front two fronts are all right side up, and when I lay the facing down I can see that the pin's on top as well, and it's making this circle that's going to go around the neck edge in the end here, and that's what you want. That will tell you that you've got a continuous line of your zigzagging from up one front, round the back facing, and then down the back here again, so you know that that's all right. Now that I'm happy I've got that pinned on, I'm going to take the pin marking the right side out of the way. I'm going to turn this over so that I can sew these two seams here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And off the edge, just to reverse again at the end there. Needle out of the work, and let's take off our starting and stopping threads. That's the first one. Oh, we've got the other one to do as well, haven't we? Let's just do this one here now. So then if we're going to follow true to form, we're now going to just zigzag these edges as well. So that's those two neatened off as well. And we can wait until towards the end if we wanted to neaten some of these edges, but the trouble is that some of them are easier to get to while we can. So at this moment in time, then if I put this with the wrong side facing up, you can see that all of the seam allowances are all on the same side, which is great. And if I put that over the other side, then correspondingly, so all of the right sides don't have any seam allowance showing up. You can see a little step change just there on the back of the neck, just at the edge there, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. We can neaten that off as we go. Okay, so the next thing then now is I want you to pop this to one side, because we're now going to make up our collar. So let's just pop this to one side. And here we've got our collar pieces. Now, we want to turn these back over so that they're right sides together this time. And I know that because my pins are on there and I can put my two pin heads together. And let's just match these. These were cut out of the same fabric and the same pattern piece at the same time, so they should all be fine. So let's just put the start and the stop together first. And I can, because I know that we're working on, got the right sides together, then I can take those pins out and use those. And I'm pinning into the centre of the garment with the pin heads out of the edge of the garment, of the collar, because that's the way that I think things work best, because it's easier to take your pins out then. And then we're going to look for that centre front and make sure that's all lying nice and flat. And then we're going to put a pin in at the centre back, just the back there. And then however many pins you need to be confident that these edges are going to stay together. That's probably all I need. Perhaps one at the end here as well, just to make sure. Oh, bent pin there. But what we're going to do is we're going to sew from here across this small flat edge. We're going to do something called pivoting in this corner. I'll show you how to do that. And then we're going to sew around here again. Probably have to do some pivoting around there, and I'll show you how to do that. And then we're going to come to this corner here, and then we're going to come into the centre. We are not going to be sewing on this inside centre line at the moment, okay? We're going to leave that undone because we want to turn this the right way round in the end. So we've got wrong sides together, we've pinned it along the two short ends, and then we've pinned it along this longer curve in order that that's all together. Pattern piece needs to go away. You can see how I tell myself as I'm organising myself as I go through, but I really think it does help. Okay, so the machine's all ready, so let's start at this section here. I need to take it off my zigzag stitch, and get my needle set up again so that it's in the right position for my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then lining up the edge of the presser foot with the edge of the fabric, the short side, then I'm going to do a few stitches down and I'm going to reverse just to hold that in place, and then I'm going to use my needle down function. I haven't explained what to do. If you haven't got a button, so hold on a second. What happens with the needle down function is that if you've got that on your machine, every time you take your foot off the pedal, your needle will always stop with your machine will always stop with your needle in your work. And whilst that might seem really annoying, it's got some really good benefits, especially when we're sewing around curves, which we'll be doing with this collar soon. For now though, just know that if you've not got that, you can use this button on the end here, the hand crank or the hand wheel, and you can just use that to move your needle up or down. But that's what you will need to use when we get down into the corner down here. So we're going to hold on to our ends. We've done our forward and back, and I've got my needle in my work. So I'm going to take my first pin out, and I'm going to sew down until I'm 1/4 inch away from this bottom edge just here. And as we get closer to this pin, I will take it out, and then I'll show you how we pivot in order to get around that corner. So we're going to sew down in this corner here with the edge of the fabric against the edge of the presser foot. I'm towards my pin, so I'm going to take my pin out now. And I'm going to carry on until I'm about 1/4 inch away from the end, to about there. And then leaving my needle in the work, either by using that button or by hand cranking it, I can then lift up my presser foot and I can now move my fabric, but the needle is holding it still in the same place, so it's not going to get a little jig in the work. What I like to do with collars is I move my fabric so that I will be sewing at 45 degrees across that corner. So I'm sewing, again, you know, hopefully you know what 45 degrees is, but say that's the collar of the shirt, I'm sewing across this way here. So I'm going diagonally across that point, just for one stitch. And then I'm going to then leave my needle in the work, lift my presser foot up, and then I'm now going to put the edge of the curve against the edge of the presser foot, and I'm going to carry on sewing. And what you'll find is that because the sewing machine can only feed the fabric through straight, and your sewing machine can only sew straight, and we've got a curve here we want to sew, you're going to bunch your fabric up if you start trying to pull it around. So you might be used to just sort of pulling your fabric around to get it to do what you want, but I want to show you a different way. So leaving your so you sew, let me get my words right, you sew straight until you can see that the next bit of your fabric is going to sew off, your needle's going to, is coming away from the side of the presser foot. At that point, leave your needle in the work, lift up your presser foot, and readjust it so that your machine is sewing down this side again. So again, it's just a small change, and then as soon as I see it starting to come off again, I'm going to lift up my presser foot and just move my fabric. And you're moving it very minimally, you're not moving it much, but it's going to give you a lovely curve around this collar without lots of sort of straight corners or what would you call it? Sharp points on your curve. That's what you're trying to avoid, and this is what this pivoting does. So sometimes when it's a small curve, you can put some weight on the fabric with your left hand and it'll sew round, but at some stage you'll get it bunching up under your presser foot, and in that's the case, that's when you need to just lift up your needle slightly, your presser foot slightly, leave your needle in the work, and then you'll be able to get round this curve really nicely. And being as the collar is the one part of this garment that you're going to see all the time, it's really worth taking some time just to get this right. So you'll see as I'm sewing round here, I'll sew round some of it, take my pins out, and then I'll start to readjust again, and it just helps take the pressure off the fabric, and it just helps come round this curve really nicely. So if you've had problems with your curves in the past, then learning how to pivot like this, take that pen out, and apologies for my squeaky pedal. Is what you'll need to do just to get that really nice. So we're going to go back into that, towards that corner again. Take your pin out as you get close to it, and then we're going to stop a 1/4 inch away from this straight edge. So So about there, maybe one more stitch. And then I'm going to do one stitch diagonally across the edge, and then I'm going to carry on up the other side as well, up this straight edge just here, and reverse at the end. There's my reverse. Needle out of the work, and then we can then take off our starting and our stopping threads. And so what I want to just show you, hopefully you'll be able to see, even though it's white thread on a white seam, hopefully you'll be able to see how lovely curved that edge of that shirt is. Really beautifully done. The other thing that we want to do now, so let's just put the machine to one side and switch that off, is that because this curve here along the edge here has to be folded inside out, so we're going to go into the centre here in a minute, not quite yet, and then we're going to fold this collar out so we get this beautiful edge on it. What we need to be aware of is that this edge here is going to have more fabric in it than here, and sometimes you get a bit of a lumpy collar. So we're going to use our pinking shears because they're perfect to take out some of that bulk. So I'm just going to take down this seam allowance probably by about just under half, but it puts these triangles, can you see? And that helps it when the fabric turns round, it helps the fabric lie lovely and flat. If you've not got pinking shears, the other thing that you can do is take your the nose of your snips and just cut little triangles into your fabric. It does sound tedious, but it will give you a much better finish on the edge of your collar than not doing any of these things at all. So you can do little triangles like that with your snips. Okay, it just takes some of that bulk out of that seam. The other thing that I want you to do as well is where you've got a point on your collar, is you're going to just take off that close to, but not through your stitches, just slightly more than 45 degrees. So we just trim that collar down. You don't need to do anything to these edges here, these straight edges on the end, because they're all fine. Let me just finish this with my pinking shears, being as I have them to hand. Clear up this mess, because then we're going to need a little iron. So let me just get my iron, and then we're going to press this first flat, and then we're going to turn it round. Okay, so I've got my wool pressing mat, and I really do like this pressing mat. It's got bits all over it, but it's really, really useful for small projects like this. You can just buy these online, and it's quite thick, but it's just a small enough space. And I've also got a little mini iron, which is very useful, although I've broken one of the legs off it, so it does tend to roll over if I'm not careful, so we'll be aware of that. Okay, so we're going to take our collar first, and this is the same way that we've just sewn it, and I'm just going to press this just to set those stitches into the fabric and just to make that all nice and flat. I've got a little bit of steam on my iron as well. And then once we've done that, I'm now going to take these sides apart. Try not to pull too much on this inside edge, but we're just going to turn it round with our fingers just nice and gently to make sure that that's turning round the right way. So we get all that seam allowance hidden on the inside of our collar, because we don't want that showing. And then you can either use a pin, or you can use, if you've got a seam gauge, you've got some little corners on your seam gauge, and they're really nice to help just move things, just to turn things. You might have a pointy tool, so I know Clover, I think it is, isn't it? Do a nice pointy tool. Don't press too hard because you'll put a hole in your fabric, but you're wanting to just get into those corners just to push that corner out. And if you can't manage it with the turning tool, you can, if you're careful, you can just use a pin just to take those edges out. And we're looking for a lovely pressed corner here, so make sure you're going right up so that you can see that stitch line right on the very edge here. And that should lie fairly flat for you. Let's go to the other side and pull this corner out just here. Just takes a few moments and a little bit of patience, but it should come out just nicely. And that little diagonal stitch just on the edge of the corner, in my opinion, just helps you get a nicer point. You're never going to get it perfectly round, because it's just not possible. It's just because of the fabric in there. And then I just lay it on my pressing mat, and I'm just using the edge of my seam gauge just to push that out. because what we want to do is we want to have that stitch line right on the edge of where we're sewing. But you can also just finger press it with your hands just as you go round, just when you make sure that that's all nice and round and pulled out. The heat and the pressure from your fingers can finger press something just so that it gives it a little bit of memory before you then have to take it to the ironing board. So that just all helps everything all sit out all nicely. Once you've got a section that you're happy with, just adjust it slightly on your ironing board, and then you can then use the iron just to press that flat. And then we can just work our way around. Press a little bit more as we go. And what you're looking for is a lovely smooth curve to your collar. Nice straight points at the end there as well. Oh, you see nice. So can you see how I've pressed that in with a little bit of the fabric poking inside there? It's not sitting quite nicely. So I can just take a pin, just pull that out so the stitch line is right on the very edge, and then just repress it. And that will just help you just get a really nice edge to your collar. Okay, so let me just pop the iron to one side. And there we've got our collar all nice and that lovely curved edge on it. So what I'm going to do now is I just want to pop this back in the machine, and I'm just going to do it just 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. I'm just going to do a row of stitches just to hold these two edges of the collar together before we try and put it into the shirt. It does just help to keep it all together. Let me move my needle across so that I can make sure that that happens. As I say, no reverse stitching. And if I need to, I will pivot. Although it does seem to be going quite nicely at the moment. To a point where I needed to pivot. And off the end. And that will just hold those two raw edges together for us whilst we're attaching this collar. We can always take out some of those stitches if we need to. You can see it's just holding it just together on the edge there. Okay. So now let's just go back to our shirt, because what I want to do is just to iron part of this shirt and this seam allowance. So each shoulder I'm just going to press flat first. So that will just help all those stitches just go nice and flat for us. So I've just done the 4 shoulder seams, and then the 2 shoulder seams that have got the face of the facing, I'm going to press those in towards the centre of the facing. So they're both going in towards the centre to each other. And then the 2 on the shoulders, I'm going to press those out so it's going towards the front, so away from the back. And just give the actual fabric a bit of a press if you want to. Mine's got a little bit creased. Cotton always does get a little bit creased. Turn this over to the right side and just make sure that we've got that all sitting nicely. And I'm ironing directly onto the cotton here, but we will be using a pressing cloth when we're working with the corduroy particularly to work with that, so that'll all be fine, but you don't need to worry about that just yet till we get onto that section. Okay, so let's put our iron away for now. Right, so I want you to put the shirt down on your on your cutting mat or your table, so that the right side is up and all of your seam allowances are down into the work surface. And I want you to have your centre back towards you, and I want you to look for the notch at the back of the neck. Then you can decide which you like of your top and your bottom of your collar. It's up to you. And then whichever side you want to be the top of your collar, you're going to have facing up. But remember the little notch we put at the back of the neck? We're going to match that now with the notch on the back of the collar. and then we're going to put a pin in with the pin head out into the neck area like this. So my pin head is here onto this section and my point is down here. We're then going to match up this collar around the edge of the neckline. So let's go to the edge first and put a pin in there to hold that steady. And then making sure that your raw edges are together, we're going to then pin this in it with as many pins as you need, but don't use too many. I've got 4 for 1/2. Might seem like a lot, but it's going to sit nicely on the shirt if we do it this way. So I go straight to the end first. So I pin my centre point first, but then once my centre point, I go right to the very end, just lying that collar nice and flat against the shirt, and then we can then put a couple more pins in just to hold that in place for us whilst we're sewing. What I would do now is we're going to just tack this in place before we do anything else, because I have found that if you try and work with too many layers in one go, we can easily get into a muddle. So let's choose a nice colour thread. I'm going to use this orange so that you can see it. Let's cut ourselves a length of that. I need a hand sewing needle, so let's just get one of those. That one will do. And I'm just going to tack this collar in place onto the shirt. So let's put a knot at the end of our thread, and I've just got my thread single for this, we don't need it to be double. And then holding the shirt carefully, just making sure you're just going through the collar and the part that you're working on. I'm going to start first with my knot out of the way, and I'm going to make my first stitch sort of at a right angle. So my knot's out the way, so hopefully that'll stay out of my stitches and not get caught in, especially as it's a different colour to my fabric. Don't want a bit of an orange spot in there. And then I've done a stitch just holding the edge of the collar down first. Now I'm going to follow that same line that we did before with the machine stitching, because hopefully we should miss that then with our stitch line. Make the tacking threads easier to pull out at the end. And I'm just using little stitches to just pop this collar on. Take your pins out as you go, because otherwise your thread tends to get tangled onto those. They don't have to be tiny, tiny stitches, but you don't want them so big that it's going to let your fabric move. You're just attaching this fabric down onto the collar. Pull the collar down onto the shirt actually, so that we can then go on to the next stage. When you get to the end, make sure that you do one stitch that goes off the end of the collar into the shirt and back in again. We want that to be almost like a double stitch, just to hold the edge of that collar in, because we don't want that little edge of the collar to fold backwards on us. Take some of these pins out. I found a little stitch over the edge, just holds that edge in place for us. Right, okay, so let's just snip that off. So here you can see my tacking threads going around there. Now what I want you to do is find the notch on the back of the facing, so that's the part opposite from your collar, and then I want you to match that with the back of the neck of your shirt and put a pin in that point, because that's really important to get that absolutely spot on. The centre back, and pulled that forward so that I've got my collar between the right side of my facing and the right side of my back. And then you're just going to smooth down these edges here towards the edge of your collar. And remember, I've got that little step in mind, so I've just smoothed that out and just put some pins in. And you will notice that in the very end where you've got the fold here, which is furthest away from the edge of the centre of your back part here, you will notice that there's no collar in that section. I'll show you in a second. Let me put a pin in just to simulate where the stitching line is going to go. Hold on 1 second. So I'll put a pin in you won't put a pin this way, this is just for me to show you. But when we turn this through, you will notice that there's going to be an edge there on the edge with that. So here's your collar with your point of your collar. and there's an edge without any collar in it, that is correct. So let's just go back again. So when you're feeling for the edge of where you've tacked your collar down, there's going to be a small section on the edge here that will have no collar in it, and that is perfectly correct. So that's how that goes. So let's go to the other side now and just smooth all that facing down now against the back edge here. Put a pin in just here. And then we're going to put a pin in just here as well. So what we've got now is we've got our collar sandwiched in between our back and our fronts, and the facing is going all the way around the back, and then we've got a little fold along the front on each front section here. That's absolutely how it should be. And then what we're going to do now is take our sewing machine, make sure you're on a straight stitch and on a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to put our stitching in to our machine, that's the word I wanted, and we're going to take a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches back on that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to then put our needle in our work so that we can then pivot around this corner. Try not to drag your fabric round. We just want to lift that presser foot up once the needle's inside, change direction so we can keep everything as lovely and flat as possible. And then keep going round, just keep to that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Stop as you get to your pins so you can take them out, and just pivot, lift your presser foot up and just change the direction of your fabric as you get round so that you can see where you are going. And we're looking for a lovely smooth line around the back of this neck of this collar. Make sure everything all lining up nicely. And then I'm going to reverse at the end again. Needle out of the work, and let's take the stitches off. Okay, the end. So this is what we're left with. We've got that lovely curved edge on that neckline all the way going round, and when we turn this round, the other way round, we'll be able to pull out the corners. The facing will go through onto the inside, and I'll show you how to make that stay, and then the collar will sit nicely on the back of that shirt and on the front. So that's how we want it to be. So let's just now go in. We're going to take out our tacking stitches, so let's just take those out because they've served their purpose now. We just wanted to make sure we've not got any puckers in our stitch line as well. So if you have got a pucker, then just undo a few stitches either side. So by a pucker where you've got like a fold in your fabric, take out a few stitches either side, smooth your fabric down, and then just re-stitch it. But hopefully you've managed to sew it without, because that does make things simpler. And then we'll need to just take these orange tacking threads out. Can work from the inside. Now if you have gone through, let's see if we've got one where we've gone, it might have one where we've gone through the tacking threads. I'll show you how to take that out without breaking your stitches. I haven't got one. Right, so if you've got a tacking thread that goes through some of your stitches and you can't pull it out, loosen it off either side of the section where you can't pull it out, and then cut your thread one side of it very close to your stitches and then pull it through. It just means that your needle has pierced the twists in the thread, and that's why it won't pull through. Happens quite a lot with tacking threads, but it's really easy to, so like this one here, look. Just take that end off, and then I'll be able to show you exactly how to do that. So just pull it through, that's it. Then we go through onto this side and then we'll be fine. So once we've got all of our tacking threads out and nothing's left, let's go to these corners. So let's just fold it back where it was so you can see where I am. So on these two corners here that hasn't got any collar in it, I just want to take a little bit of that bulk off, just on the corner there. Don't go too close to your stitches, otherwise you'll compromise it. but just take off enough that that's going to reduce the bulk in that corner. And then again around the back of the neck where I'd got it a little bit proud, probably just my tracing perhaps, then I'm just going to take off those edges as well. The other thing that we can do on the neck edge here is we can do some snips. So whereas before we've done the triangles, this time we're just going to do some snips, and we're just going to snip into our work with the nose of our needles, a bit like we did for the notches, up to, well, a couple of threads away from, but almost up to our fabric, up our stitch line, and that will then just take everything, just allow this to turn through nicely. And I'll show you how we're going to do this in a bit. And where your seam allowances are, if you just push your finger across there, you'll see a little corner just go up. Just snip that off as well, front and back if you can, because you don't need those. It'll just help reduce the bulk. It's only a minuscule amount, but you'll be surprised what a difference all these little bits just add up to make. So I'm just going around the back of the neck of this shirt, just so it's all going to sit out nicely. And what you want is that, as you can see, when the collar's together, you can't see anything. But as I pull the collar flat, can you see how those snips are all stretching? And that's what we want. That helps it just turn through and all sit nicely. So one more seam allowance just to trim off there. Okay. So let's go back to our ironing board. We'll get back into the picture. And the first thing that we want to do is just give this seam just a press that we've just sewn. Just to press it nice and flat, get those stitches into the fabric nicely. Then what we can do is we're going to pull the collar away from the rest of the bodice, and you're going to find now that it kind of feels a bit like a jumbled mess, because what we need to do is we're going to pull these corners out away from the shirt first, and then we're going to just make those into little points at the edge. So like we did on the collar, we're going to pull out that so that we've got the stitch line right on the very edge just there. I've got a stray thread, let me just trim that off. That's it. Try and neaten up as I go because it's much easier to trim them as you see them. And then let's go to the other side of the collar and pull that out. Oops, where's my pin gone? Let's put it back in. And then we're going to just pull out the edges on here as well to make sure that that's sitting nice and flat too. Just takes a little bit of practice to get these corners pulled out, but you'll end up with lots of practice in the end. Okay. So then what I'm going to do then is put the collar flat on my work surface, on my pressing mat, and I'm just going to press the facing using the nose of my iron so that that's going to sit nice and flat. Just be careful if you've got steam on, otherwise you will be burning your fingers. So it's the collar that I've got flat, nothing else at the moment. So I'm just giving that collar a nice press. Just need a little bit more coming out on this corner here. And then what I want to do now is press the face, have the facing down flat on my ironing board and have the collar all crinkled up. And it seems a bit counterintuitive, but we're just trying to flatten things down a bit and get our bearings so that we can do the next step, which is going to be called understitching. And it's a really lovely thing to learn how to do because it gives you such a massive difference on the garments that you make. So let's get all of this all nice and flat and make sure that you're pulling your collar away from your garment and making sure it's all nice and flat. And I've managed to iron a couple of puckers in just there, can you see? So let me just go back and just iron those out. We don't want any puckers in the seam that we're doing. Then I'll just go over the collar again. So you kind of try, the two parts of the garment, the collar and the actual body of the garment included the facing, are curving at different ratios at the moment. But when we put them together onto the character, just borrow Harvey a moment, just here, look, and put that around his back. Just look how lovely that collar is sitting now. Beautifully. And then around to the front here, look, we're going to have those flat bits overlap, and that's going to give him his lovely collar on the front there too. So as you can see, everything's working to plan. It's just a matter of working with the garment in order to get it to sit flat. So you can try your garment onto your character too, and just make sure that that's all working nicely. The first thing that I've noticed is that I can see some of my tacking threads. So let me just get my glasses, because I'm going to remove those first before we do the understitching. So these are the tacking threads that were just holding the edges of the collar together whilst we stitch. So I'm just going to take those out. You could leave them in, but I think it's just about neatening up your sewing. So I'm only going to remove them as far as I can see them. Don't worry about any little pinpricks that are in the fabric, because those will disappear with a little bit of steam and a little bit of heat. So just have a quick check around your collar and just see if you've got any stitches that you can see at the moment. And if you can, then my suggestion would be to take those out. Can't see any more, so that's fine. So it's only that one place. A little press. You can always just put a little bit of water on as well, and that will always get rid of any of those little marks. So you can just see they're only just really faint just in there now, but they're out. Okay, so pressing mat goes to one side again now, because we're going to be doing our understitching. So we need our machine. So with understitching, what we will be doing is we will be stitching on the edge of the facing inside the garment, but we will be stitching the seam allowance and the facing together. So if we pull the actual back of the fabric away from the collar, what you're left with in your hand then is the facing, the seam allowance of the facing, the seam allowance of the collar, and the seam allowance of the back. And we want to be stitching that so that the collar is flat against the back of the garment and all of those seam allowances are pushed towards your facing. So what we're going to do then is, starting at the start of the collar, we're going to do a row of stitches into the facing, but just about 1/8 of an inch away from this sewn edge attaching the collar, just here. And what that does is that when you actually turn your collar round, it will pull part of the collar with it, so it'll give you a lovely edge, and you'll never see the inside of the garment pushing onto the outside. It's a really good tip. It feels like it shouldn't work, but it really works really well. So seam allowance, so put the garment down so you've got the right side of the back up and you can see your collar, and then you've got your facing just pulled out so that you just can see the line of stitches where the collar attaches to the facing. And then I line up a line on my presser foot and I line up my needle so that I'm just really close to it. And I'm going to just start sewing, needle in the work, and so I've got hands free. Now this is one place where you can pull your fabric, so I'm going to just pull this straight. Remember those little snips we put in the collar? We're going to pull those straight so that we are sewing a straight line through here. I'll show you once I've finished. If you're not quite sure what I mean, and then just wait till I've finished and then look back at the video again to hear the explanation, and I'll show you exactly what it is that you need to do. Just make sure that your backs and your fronts are all pulled away from each other so that you can get to that seam allowance. And then I'll just take that stitch out, and then I leave tails on mine because I'm going to pull it through to the inside. So here's my facing. Let me get this little thing to point with. Here's the row of stitching I've just done, just there. And there's the seam that attached the collar. And here's my collar. So when I push the facing through to the inside, you can't see any stitches on the back. I've not gone through all of the edges. You can't see it on the back. but then once we try and fold that collar round, it just keeps it tidy so that all of you can see that collar, and it's going to give you a really nice, neat finish. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. It's called understitching. It's great. I love it. Understitching is great. I use it a lot in my sewing. So where we start and where we stopped, we've got these raw edges. If you notice, I didn't reverse because I want to keep it nice and neat. So what we're going to do now is go onto the inside of the garment, onto that facing, and then, oh, let me just put my glasses on because I need them for this close-up work without throwing everything around, is we're just going to pull on the thread and get the loop of the bobbin thread coming through, and then I'm just going to use my quick unpick, she says, to pull on the loop, and that will pull the other thread through from the other side. So you can see we've got no reverse stitch in there, bulky, just all lovely and nice and neat. And now I'm going to do 2 knots with the ends of my thread, and then I'm going to snip it off. So it just gives you a much neater finish than reverse stitching does. So let's go to this other side again. So there's my thread one way on the outside of my garment, and here's a thread on the inside. So let's just pull gently on the thread on the inside, and you'll see the little loop come through. And then if you just get your quick unpick point through the loop, you can just see it there, and then you can pull it through, and then you have, like magic, you have no ends on that side, but you have it on this side, both of them together, and then we can then tie these off. 2 knots should be fine, and then we're just going to snip it off. Okay, just make sure your points of your shirt are out nicely. Make sure that's all folding over. And so there we go, we've got the start of our collar and our shirt looking all lovely on the edge there. I'm going to leave it here for part 1. Hopefully I've not made the video too long already. It is a 2-part video because there's a lot to cover here. And in part 2 we're going to be putting in the sleeves, and then we're going to be hemming, and we're going to be tidying it all up, and then sewing our buttons on and sewing our press studs on. So I'm going to leave that here for now, and I'll just turn the camera up so I can just show you where we've got to. So let's just pop this shirt, now we've got our collar all nicely finished, back onto Harvey. I know it's not finished yet, but this part is for now. So yeah, so let's just get this onto Harvey. Sorry, I've not been 100%, I've had a bit of a cough and cold, and I just needed to have a bit of a cough then. So there's Harvey's shirt onto him, looking all beautiful, as it's all going to sit lovely and flat. And as I say, doing this in 2 parts, I hope you've enjoyed stitching with me today. If it's your first time watching one of my videos, they are a little bit wordy, and I kind of apologise, but I don't. I want to include as much detail as I can do so you can get as much out of your sewing and you can get the very best result possible. It might be a bit much if you're a complete beginner at first, but I'll repeat the same messages over and over again throughout my videos, and you will then pick that up before it becomes second nature to you. So the idea is that we don't just get a finished garment, we get a beautiful finished garment, and that's what I'm hoping to help you achieve. So bear with me, because hopefully at the end, once you see Harvey in all of his finery, you'll be really happy that I've included some of those tips and tricks. So pop along to part 2, and that should be live. I'll load them both up together, so you should be able to go straight from one onto the other. And as I say, we're going to be putting in the sleeves and hemming those. We'll be hemming the bottom of the shirt, and we'll be doing our buttons and getting everything all finished with that. If you have found value in the content today, I'd love it if you give the video a thumbs up. If you want to say hello to me, I'm actually in southern Spain. I'm an English expat living in southern Spain, so please drop in the comments, say hi from wherever you're watching from, because that's always interesting, and Harvey and I like to know where you're watching from. And if you'd like to become a subscriber, then please do. I've got dressmaking videos, I've got other sewing videos as well, and hopefully you'll find something of interest there. And I'm hoping to be working with Richard and Claire throughout 2024, and we've got some really lovely plans for some great characters and some clothing for them to be made. So I've really enjoyed having you here with me today. Have a great day everybody, happy stitching, and I'll see you in part 2. Take care, bye.